There's a moment that doesn't get talked about much. The moment you realize that if you stopped reaching out, no one would notice. Not immediately, not dramatically, just quietly. No messages piling up, no concern, no sense that your absence would create a ripple in anyone's day. That realization doesn't feel like loneliness at first. It feels like clarity. And once you feel it, something inside you changes. People often assume that having no friends means being antisocial, that you dislike people, that you prefer isolation. But most people with no friends didn't reject connection. They learned to survive without it. If you have no friends, you've probably learned how to talk about it without really talking about it. You say you're independent. You say you keep to yourself. You say you're busy. What you don't say is that friendship stopped feeling safe a long time ago. At some point, connection became unstable. People drifted, conversations faded, promises dissolved without explanation. After enough quiet endings, something in you adapted. You stopped expecting consistency. You stopped assuming closeness would last. You learned how to exist without leaning on anyone. At first, that self-reliance feels like strength. You become capable, emotionally contained, efficient. People admire this. They call you strong, mature, self-sufficient. But there's a difference between being alone and being unseen. Over time, the absence of friendship weaves itself into your life. You stop waiting for messages. You stop expecting invitations. You stop imagining yourself in group settings. Not because you don't want connection, but because wanting it started to feel foolish. You become careful socially, slow to open up, more observant than expressive. When you've gone too long without friends, interaction feels fragile. Every word feels weighted. Every reaction feels significant. You don't want to misread closeness. You don't want to invest in something that might disappear again. So you stay measured, polite, reserved. People with no friends often seem calm. They don't demand attention. They don't take up much space. But inside, there's tension. Because closeness feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things don't feel safe. You might tell yourself you don't need friends, that you prefer your own company, that relationships complicate things. Sometimes that's partly true, but often friendship once required more emotional energy than it gave back. Maybe you were always the one who reached out first, the one who remembered details, the one who stayed loyal while others moved on. Maybe you learned that caring deeply didn't guarantee being chosen. So instead of repeating that pain, you learned to detach quietly. This detachment didn't happen all at once. It happened through small moments, unanswered messages, uneven effort, silences that lasted too long. Eventually, your nervous system learned something important. It's safer not to rely on anyone. So you built a life that didn't require friendship to function. You became your own companion, your own support system. You learned to process emotions alone, to celebrate quietly, to grieve without witnesses. And in many ways, it worked. You function, you move forward, you don't collapse under loneliness. But something subtle happens when this lasts too long. You begin to feel untethered, not excluded, just separate. Life feels nearby, not something you're fully inside of. Others have shared histories and familiar faces. You have routines. Routines are safe, but they aren't the same as belonging. You don't expect much from others, so you ask for almost nothing. Your struggles stay private, your emotions contained. People without friends become emotionally efficient. They compress their inner world. They simplify needs, not because they don't feel deeply, but because there's no clear place to put those feelings. So adaptation looks like independence, calm, being okay alone. Beneath that calm is a quiet awareness that if something went truly wrong, there would be no one to call, no familiar voice, no shared history to lean on. Sometimes that awareness just exists, and sometimes, late at night, it becomes heavier. Not as desperation, but as absence. The absence of being known, of being remembered in small ways, of being part of someone else's everyday life. Still, you don't rush to change it, because hoping again feels riskier than staying alone. So you live carefully, self-contained, functioning, and somewhere inside you, a question lingers, not why you have no friends, but when friendship stopped feeling like something you could trust. To understand the psychology of people with no friends, we have to begin with an unspoken truth. People don't stop forming friendships because they lack the ability. They stop because their nervous system learns that closeness is unreliable. For many, isolation isn't a preference, it's a conclusion. A conclusion formed after repeated experiences where connection required effort but offered little stability, where relationships felt uneven, where care was given more often than it was returned. Over time, the mind adapts by lowering expectations, not consciously, instinctively. If I don't rely on anyone, I can't be disappointed. If I don't attach, I can't lose. This belief doesn't announce itself. It settles quietly into behavior, into how you plan your days, into how you manage your emotions. Psychologically, this pattern often forms after inconsistent connection, sometimes early in life, sometimes later, through repeated relational loss. Not always dramatic trauma, often prolonged unpredictability. Friendships that faded without explanation. People present only when it was convenient. Connections that required constant effort to maintain. The brain responds to inconsistency with vigilance, always watching for shifts in tone, always scanning for withdrawal. And when those signs appear, the response is simple: withdraw first. Not out of bitterness, out of self-protection. Neuroscience shows repeated social disappointment activates the same stress responses as physical threat. The body learns that attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability, once punished, is avoided. This is why many people with no friends feel calm but guarded, regulated but emotionally distant, stable but hollow. They know how to keep themselves steady without relying on others. They can self-soothe. They can problem-solve alone. But independence comes at a cost. When everything is regulated internally, there is no external mirror. No one to reflect experiences back to you. No shared meaning. Life becomes something you manage, not something you share. Another layer of this psychology is identity. Long periods without friends subtly change how you see yourself. You stop experiencing yourself as someone inside other people's lives. You exist adjacent to connection, not within it. In groups, you may feel invisible, not rejected, just peripheral, like an observer rather than a participant. Over time, this erodes self-worth, not because you feel unlikable, but because no one is actively choosing you. And when no one chooses you, eventually you stop choosing yourself in relational spaces. You don't initiate, you don't assume interest, you don't risk closeness. Because risking closeness means risking disappointment again. This creates a loop. The longer you go without friends, the more unfamiliar friendship becomes. The more unfamiliar it feels, the harder it is to engage, not because you don't want connection, but because your nervous system no longer recognizes it as safe. People with no friends often describe themselves as emotionally self-sufficient. They can handle things alone. They aren't panicked by solitude, but self-sufficiency is not the same as fulfillment. There's a difference between coping alone and being nourished by connection. Over time, that difference becomes noticeable, a dull emptiness without a clear source, not sadness, absence. You feel it during milestones. Good news with no one to tell, hard days carried quietly, You become the sole witness of your life. This can lead to a belief that friendship belongs to an earlier stage of life, that it had a window, that you somehow missed it. But that belief isn't truth. It's grief disguised as resignation. Grief for connections that didn't last. Grief for belonging that never solidified. Grief for versions of yourself that once hoped for more. When grief goes unacknowledged, it turns into withdrawal, not failure, protection. Healing doesn't begin by forcing yourself to socialize or blaming yourself for being alone. It begins by understanding how isolation became protective, by recognizing solitude wasn't chosen because you're deficient, but because it was safer. The capacity for connection didn't disappear, it learned to wait. People who reconnect later often do so differently, more selective, more intentional, less willing to accept shallow closeness. They don't seek many friends, they seek resonance, and resonance requires safety. That safety begins internally, by allowing yourself to want connection again without judging the wanting. Not demanding immediacy, not expecting permanence, just allowing possibility, because having no friends is not an identity. It's a state, one shaped by experience, adaptation, and self-protection. And states can change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, when the nervous system learns that connection doesn't always end in loss, when silence becomes space, not proof of failure. The absence you live with is not evidence that you're unworthy of friendship. It's evidence that you learned how to survive without it. And survival, while powerful, was never meant to be the final destination.